coming.
Thanks so much for having us.
No, pleasure. Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Teitelbaum, and I'm the director of Your Art Gallery of Ontario, and it's extraordinary that you chose art instead of a Saturday afternoon in the sun. It's wonderful, and it's incredible. We're going to have Matthew Barney back every week because you're all so young, and it makes us feel good. So thank you for being here. It is a special occasion for us to welcome Matthew Barney. Kitty Scott, the AGO's curator of modern and contemporary art, is going to introduce him, and then they're going to engage in a conversation. I want to acknowledge Kitty's wonderful installation of Matthew's work on the 4th floor. If you haven't seen it, please go up afterwards and enjoy. I want to make a special acknowledgement of Jorn Weisbrodt, the artistic director of Luminato. You've made Toronto pretty special.
Thank you.
There are people who bring energy to a community, and Jorn, you're one of them, and we're very grateful. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. So now that's it. I'm going to step down and join you in a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Kitty Scott.
So thank you, Matthew. I want to welcome Jorn and Matthew Barney here to our house. Thank you both for coming and joining us this afternoon. And I want to thank all of you for coming. It's such a beautiful day outside. It's really nice to see you all here. I'm thrilled to introduce Matthew Barney, who is joining us in Toronto to celebrate his new film, River of Fundament, presented by the Luminato Festival and playing this evening and Sunday afternoon at the Elgin Theatre. An installation of his video works from the ongoing Drawing Restraint series are on display at the AGO from May 31st through September 28th, 2014, on the 4th floor. That's just above us here. So. And finally, there's a presentation of Barney's acclaimed Cremaster cycle at TIFF Bell Lightbox later this afternoon at 4. Barney was born in 1967 in San Francisco. He has been exhibiting since the early 90s. His work is internationally renowned, and he has been the recipient of many awards. His most recent project, River of Fundament, is the subject of a major exhibition currently on view in the Haus der Kunst, Munich. Barney's many solo exhibitions include Prayer Sheet with Wound and Nail at the Schaulager Basel, Drawing Restraint at Kunsthalle Vienna and at the Serpentine Gallery, London, as well as many others at the Solomon R. Guggenheim, New York, the Museum Ludwig Cologne, and the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. Barney lives and works in New York. So thank you for coming. I'd like to begin with a series of questions around the Drawing Restraint works that are in the gallery above us. Your series, Drawing Restraint, has been ongoing since 1987, when you were still a student. The series began with a desire to apply the same tension, desire, and resistance of a physical regime to an artistic practice. Drawing from what you knew as a young athlete, has this perspective and approach changed, and how important is the physical body in your practice more broadly?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that my interest in storytelling was there from the start, but I don't think I knew what to do with it, really, in the beginning. And I think what I did know what to do with was to use my body as a tool. Like I understood that. And so I think by default, I started setting up these situations with my body and experimenting that way on my own and asking a friend to videotape it. But I think that documentation was always important to me. And I think it had largely to do with the type of work that I was gravitating toward, work from the 60s, body-based performance, where the documentation was scant. It was one photograph or maybe a clip of something, if I was lucky, that I had seen. And so I think I became really interested in the narrative that I was drawing onto something that I only understood partially. So I think that's where storytelling began for me was, in a way, abstracting something that I had performed, into video and into, eventually into the works around the time of Otto Shaft from 91, 92, where a kind of hybrid was made between a real-time document and something which was more of a proposal, something which may or may not have happened, and starting to experiment with the language of cinema to create that kind of proposal.
Your persona and identity as an artist figures strongly in your work, and you've always been a protagonist in the Drawing Restraint works. In Drawing Restraint 17, which is on view upstairs, you cast a young woman as the main character for the first time. How did this narrative come about, and is she meant to be a stand-in for you? It was more of a response to the exhibition, the prayer sheet for the Wounded Nail, and the proposal that the curator, Neville Wakefield, had made to integrate works from that region that were both religious and non, from the period of the Northern Renaissance. And so I got interested in these memento mori pieces that are very strong from that region, and some of the stronger examples are in Basel, the Baldwin Green paintings of what are they? Death of the Maiden.
Death in the Maiden, yeah, exactly. And so the Drawing Restraint 17 is to do with that, the tradition of the memento mori.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how did you come to cast her, though? It's the whole act of climbing, in a way. I mean, you used to do that yourself early on.
I guess that there is this branch of competitive climbing that takes place indoors. This kind of non-protected free climbing on an interior wall, and there are different forms of it. But the stronger climbers are getting younger and younger and younger. Something like gymnastics or something, where pretty soon you have a teenager who's beating everybody. And so I started looking, after thinking about those Baldwin Green paintings, thinking about casting a very young woman in that role, and started looking at the climbers who are out there competing. And I met Emily Harrington and started talking to her about this piece. And of course, from her perspective, it was I think mostly interesting to be involved in that stunt, the falling,
Right.
which she performed part of, and then the higher part of the fall was performed by a body double who was a specialist in free falls.
Okay. So, I guess you recently mentioned in an interview with Okwe and Wenzer that you lost interest in filmmaking during the production of Drawing Restraint 9. Mm-hmm. How did you keep moving Drawing Restraint forward after this, and where do you see its future?
Well, Drawing Restraint was always an interval for me. It was always about, after its initial concentration, let's say, it was a way of having a pause between larger ideas, or let's say the sort of unstableness that you feel when you're working with a new idea. I think I always came back to Drawing Restraint knowing that it was available to me. And that said, the Drawing Restraint, starting with probably number 7, became more and more narrative, and they started allowing more of the cinematic language in. And Drawing Restraint 9 was very much about that, about trying to really bring the cinematic language into that body of work. But it was an anomaly, in the Drawing Restraints. And after that, 10, 11, 12, they became very simple again. And I think they became simple because I needed that simplicity in
Right.
between
Yeah.
projects. So I think I'll continue to do them. I did one in Munich some months ago, where we took a block of graphite that's 4,000 pounds, and had a women's American football team. It's part of a German league. Come and they dragged and pushed the block around the main gallery of the exhibition, and left a line on the wall with the block, which was
Drawing.
very unruly and slippery. And
Yes, where do you get a big block of graphite like that?
it was made by a graphite producer in Detroit.
Germany. That's maybe a good segue into River Fundament, which obviously is a film, a very big film, based on Norman Mailer's book, Ancient Evenings. And to start off with, can you maybe just tell us briefly, I know it's hard and take as much time, the story of your film?
The story,
Or the book, or whatever you prefer, or Ancient Evenings.
maybe we could talk about the starting point,
Yeah.
like where it started, in terms of what Kitty was asking, because it's true that I lost interest in approaching, let's say, the moving image in the same way that I had before. That after drawing Restraint 9, I felt like if I were to make another work like that, it would take me through the same emotional arc. And in that way, I felt like that experiment was finished. And so it was around the time that that Mailer had proposed to me that I look at Ancient Evenings and consider it as a text for something. I think in his mind it was a film. That I was trying to think of ways of rewiring my practice as a filmmaker, whatever that meant. And so Jonathan Bepler and I had always talked about opera and in what way opera related to what we had done with the Cremaster films. That there are certain things in those films that do relate to that tradition. And there are other things that relate to the performance tradition, situations that we set up and we ran in real time, and were either unrehearsable or only partially rehearsable. So there was really a sort of sense of on set of something that could really only be experienced by those people on the crew. And I always lamented that. I always felt, and Jonathan did too, and his relationship to performance and theater is much stronger than mine, but we always talked about that. What if we could take this quality and make a whole work out of it?
In the theater.
We didn't really know.
But with a live audience.
Yeah, exactly. And so when we started talking about it, it was in fact to be made for stage, possibly in opera houses. We didn't know. And we started writing, and again, Mailer had called me around that time and suggested Ancient Evenings to me. And so I said to him, I think I want to make an opera. I don't really know what that means yet, but this seems to have a structure, at least, that would be helpful for us as a libretto. And so we started working with it, and it was less than a year later, he passed away. So we were still in the middle of developing what we were doing. And as you know, we made that sketch in Manchester that was, like, we took a couple of the ideas that we had been talking about and made a piece for stage there that was 45 minutes long. And there I learned that I was not interested in the stage for this piece, and that I really needed the tools that I was used to using, the physicality of being in front of something, and the close-up, and the texture.
Was it mainly, what was it about the theater that didn't satisfy you in that setting?
I guess it's the fixed perspective, and and
And the bull.
and just and the bull, right? I felt like I couldn't embrace the machinery of the stage the way that I felt you have to. Like if you're really going to work in that environment, you got to love that machine, and I just didn't fall in love with it. So we started talking about a more site-specific convention for the piece, and went to LA and performed Ren, and then we did Coup in Detroit, and then after that, the project became more cinematic and more hybrid. We started staging scenes for the camera only, and in a way to support those scenes that we had filmed in the live performances, which I think were very strong but didn't really have a point of view. I think as I started to become more interested in this thing being a film of some sort, it felt like we needed that. We needed a point of view. It needed direction that it lacked, actually. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience of reading Mailer's Ancient Evenings, and by what process did you begin to interpret the book?
I guess there were two things that caught my, that engaged me to begin with. One was the first part of the book where, in first person, there's the description of a man dying, and he's describing these levels of his soul departing one by one. And I think structurally that started to become interesting as a way of breaking up the work into 7 stages. And I also really loved, and just as I had before with Executioner's Song, which we used in Cremaster 2, the way that Mailer describes the landscape, sort of in tandem with the character, and they become somewhat interchangeable. And I think that's something that that I need, I think, to do what I want to do. In terms of scale and in terms of kind of using an object language in the realm of cinema.
In Egyptian mythology, Osiris is the god of the afterlife, the underworld, the dead. In the film, you play 2 characters, Osiris, James Lee Byers, and the Ka of Norman Mailer. Can you talk about why you chose to play those 2 particular characters? What attracted you to them?
I guess that one of the starting points with the adaptation of Ancient Evenings was to replace some of the characters, and there's so many characters in that novel that it's a little bit overwhelming, but to take the protagonist and replace it with an object. And so the first concept was to take the surviving car from Cremaster 3, which we still had, the Imperial, and use that as a starting point. And then I got more interested in the possibility of them recycling certain aspects of the Cremaster 3 story into the adaptation. And I think this has to do with the way that Ancient Evenings depends so much on Egyptian mythology, and and it uses it in a very, very direct way, in a much more direct way than I would be comfortable doing. And I felt like with Cremaster 3, there was that territory had been dealt with through Freemasonry, and in the way that the Masonic narrative has strong connections to the Egyptian mythology. And so it felt like I had to relate those two things. And in fact, I think that one of the reasons Mailer proposed this book to me is because he had seen Cremaster 3, and there are certain similarities, I think, particularly in the beginning of Cremaster 3, the way that the apprentice comes up through the Chrysler Building,
right.
and it has a very similar feeling to the beginning of Ancient Evenings. So I think what at first felt like, I don't know, it felt like I could be simply repeating myself by taking this novel on. It started to feel more and more exciting to me to deal with something that's so well known and I don't know, full of pitfalls, the way that Egyptian mythology is.
Yeah. I'm curious also about James Lee Byers as a figure. He's somebody that shows up in the film. There are maybe 5. Are there 5? Is that right? 4 or 5?
At one point, there are 5 of them.
5. Yeah. Just if you want to talk a little bit about your interest in him with respect to the narrative.
And Byers, yeah.
A little bit who Byers is for those who don't know, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it started by realizing that he was born in Detroit and died in Cairo, and of course his work certainly has an Egyptianness to it. So there were some quite obvious entry points to it, but I think what ended up becoming more important to me was the way that I was starting to take some of Mailer's description of material from the novel and trying to abstract the narrative arc into a progression of metals, essentially, that started with, the more kind of fundamental state of iron, lead, zinc, to copper, and through the copper alloys, brass, bronze, leading toward a kind of goldness that it couldn't achieve. That, that there's a theme that runs through the text that has to do with ambition, really. It's about the protagonist is a nobleman who worked for the pharaoh, and he wanted everything that the pharaoh had, but he didn't have the right to have it. So he became a sorcerer and figured out ways of kind of tricking his way through a couple of rebirths. And so I got interested in how that could be described through these alloys, in a way, the yellow metal alloys that are trying to be gold but can't be gold. And there's something in James Lee Byers that's, I think, very much about that. It's about the veneer of goldness, but it's never solid gold, ever. It might be spray painted gold or a thin layer of gold leaf, but it's sort of a theatrical version of divinity, that I love, but it's also very sad in a way. But Byers is very compelling that way.
And in the film, you were talking about the main character, Manny, who undergoes these transformations in order to achieve pharaoh-like status. And you substituted him with Norman Mailer. Why did you choose to do that?
I think I was most influenced by this Harold Bloom review in the New York Review of Books that came out around the time of the release of the novel. And Bloom suggested that Ancient Evenings was autobiographical, and that the nobleman is Mailer and the pharaoh is the American literary canon, or Hemingway, or somebody who sort of has that status that Mailer wanted, but it was elusive to him. And it was an interesting interpretation for me, I think, and it definitely influenced all of these scenes that we filmed later in the house, and as a way of bringing the character of Norman Mailer himself into the story.
And now from Manny to Norman Mailer, can we sort of do the step to Matthew Barney? Do you see yourself in that
Well,
role as well?
insofar as I think that what Bloom was proposing wasn't necessarily that Mailer couldn't write that book, The Great American Novel. It's that America might not need it. That it's an obsolete ambition. And and meanwhile, you have Mailer running for mayor, sort of functioning as a celebrity as much as a journalist, as much as a novelist, sort of doing all those things at the same sports commentary. He was involved in so many different things that I feel close to that in some ways, that I think that my generation, we inherited something from that sensibility, from the notion of working in multiple mediums and not really feeling like there's any issue with moving across the boundaries from one medium to the other. That it isn't really about making a statement and doing that. It's what is available and what feels natural. And I hadn't really thought about that until quite recently, really, that Mailer has something to do with that, I think. He figures in there in that lineage somewhere. And so I think, like with the narrative in Cremaster 3, I look at somebody like Richard Serra like that. Like, I look at that work and I think, how in the hell can anybody make that? I love it.
I think that's what a lot of people think about your work, too.
But it's just like, it's reductive quality and its relative purity is like amazing to me and not available to me either.
Well, luckily. We don't want a Richard Serra copy.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the form that the film takes? Because it's an opera, it's a film. You collaborated with Jonathan Bepler, and if you want to just talk about how image and music, and I guess how the whole thing unfolds, and how you thought about that structure and the form, how you think about it.
Well, I think the way that it's being presented is relatively specific. That first of all, it's being presented in performing arts festivals largely, like not film festivals, and not, for the most part, not in the context of a visual arts institution. That we felt that the relationships we had made with the performing arts were stronger in this piece than with the language of cinema. And we wanted to present it in that context, to try to find its natural audience and its sort of natural feeling. And so we are presenting it in proscenium houses and whenever possible in opera houses, and setting up the surround sound and the screen, which is a commitment for the presenters. It's and one that I appreciate.
How was your working relationship with Jonathan Bepler, though? It seems that with Cremaster, music sort of was more in the traditional filmic kind of sense, added later. And here, it's so much integral part of the action on stage, and it almost seems maybe in some parts the composition was first and then the scene sort of came around that or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, well, first of all, with Cremaster, there were instances of both. And I think our relationship was really galvanized through those scenes where it was developed together. Like, for example, the scene with the bees and the drummer in Cremaster 2, for example. That scene was really developed together. We talked about it from the beginning. And then there were other scenes, as you're saying, which were scored. They were put together visually first, and then they were scored. But in River of Fundament, we specifically wanted to start together and write the piece together. And there are scenes where a visual proposal led the way, and then there are other scenes where a musical proposal led the way. the assembly line of those metal instruments being fabricated, for example. That was something that Jonathan wrote, and my studio, we figured out how to make them, but he was very interested in the sounds they would make as they were being fabricated, and the sort of knowing that there's no way they would hold a tune, and trying to find very accomplished string players to perform from Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and so that was something that he really drove, and then there were other scenes. I don't know, like the scene that Paul Giamatti's character and John Mailer's character play in in what was the bathroom, that becomes that alchemical chamber. Like that was written around a passage in the Ancient Evenings text, but around the abstraction of that into that brass casting. And so Jonathan responded to that after with a kind of viola piece that, so there was both,
Do you
and we have that experience.
Talk a little bit. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Talk a little bit about the environment. When you watch the film, you see scenes of, I would say, kind of over-industrialization, maybe the decline of the industrial age. There's a sense of kind of pollution, excrement, the river of feces, all that sort of thing. At the end, there are beautiful scenes of nature. I think in Idaho, the salmon spawning. Do you want to talk about the environment and maybe the landscape in relationship to this particular film, where they're shifting? I mean, it really shifts. It goes through very urban, very dense kinds of scenes to this very natural world, and just how you think about that transition, that place, those places.
Well, again, I think Mailer's description of the landscape is so specific and so strong in the way, for example, that the way that molten iron exists beneath the surface, that sulfur comes to the surface, in the description, sort of running in tandem with the description of a dying body. That there's a naturalness actually to that, and to this, and to this elemental, to this work that's probably different from things that I've done in the past, and that I'm thinking of other descriptions of Mailer's where the god Set or Seth is described, where his semen is described as mercury or as being toxic, and that if he, or any god for that matter, ejaculates without it going into the body of another god, it creates a new disease. And so that there's a kind of inherent toxicity to the gods. And particularly with Set, who's the god of storms, or he represents ambivalence, I think. That there's that the way Mailer describes ambivalence, or the balance in nature, I find quite compelling in terms of relative toxicity that exists already beneath the soil. So to be honest, I think I was really avoiding not going to Detroit, but I was avoiding going to Detroit and getting into, ruins porn, basically, because I thought that it would tip the balance away from that sort of naturalism that we had been working with. And so by the time we arrived in Detroit, I was looking at locations like the salt mine beneath the city, and thinking about the different way in which the mineral wealth of that area is really the foundation of Henry Ford's whole effort, really, that he had all the minerals that he needed there. And what we ended up with, I think, was a kind of compromise in between as far as, showing Detroit as an open wound.
Yes.
And allowing for some of that kind of collapse without focusing on it. I don't know if this answers your question, but it's...
I mean, I guess Hemingway is situated in a much more natural environment, or kind of mountainside. A place, I guess, you connect with immortality and that sort of thing. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, I grew up not far from there, and I think that mythology was always quite legible, that his cabin where he committed suicide is very close to Redfish Lake, where the salmon go to die, after they return from the Pacific Ocean. And so I think it was always sort of loaded with that narrative, that landscape, for me.
There seems to be, though, in the film, or at least to me, sometimes a strong, I don't know if it's criticism is the right word, but of industrialism and the way you have in Los Angeles sort of those clogged highways, the dirty, the Detroit, the open wound, as you said, sort of those shipyards in Brooklyn. It seems almost that sort of what man makes in the world is sort of destroying nature, and that there is sort of this cycle of decay out of which the main character wants to transform basically into something new. But it seems that also in the wake scenes that are basically following a further and a further decay, that you are sort of describing this downfall in a way with the film as well.
I mean, I think, for me, I see it in a more cyclical way. And to go back to Detroit, because it's easier to talk about, I think, that without the kind of grassroots energy that you feel in Detroit right now, it wouldn't be as compelling to me. That you have the full range there, from the prehistoric mineral deposit, through the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the collapse, and all of the architecture that was left behind, to this sort of grassroots reorganization of the city, which I think all of those things are so visible at once in that place. And I think that's the range that I'm interested in that full cycle.
So something that we're not seeing here in Toronto, but the people who watched the film in Munich in Germany at the Haus, in Munich, were able to see the exhibition at the Haus der Kunst. And could you talk a little bit about the sculptures that you've produced recently that are related to this particular film, and some I think are actually made in the course of the film, is that correct? Or,
some are and some are not,
Or there's a deep connection anyway. So if you want to talk about materiality, maybe form and the concept of that exhibition.
Yeah. I mean, largely this body of work is made in metal, and I guess I talked a little bit about that progression of metals. And so with these sculptures, there's a cast lead work, a zinc piece, a very large cast iron work, which I think there's a picture of the system that we made, that 25-ton object with, which was something like a medieval casting system that we set up in on a site in Detroit next to the river. There's a cast bronze work, cast brass, sterling silver, and some electroplated gold pieces. So that progression of metals that I had described was kind of the governing principle of this body of work. But I think the thing for me that's more different about it than the materiality is just its relationship to sculptural tradition, sculpture making tradition, you know, that I think I was at least educated in a period where the post-minimal tradition was the work that we were all looking to, you know, Smithson, Beuys, Sarah, Eva Hess, you know, that was like that kind of dialogue and material was it was how I was schooled. And I think the idea of making a cast bronze piece was just like not available to me, not available until this body of work came, and to read these descriptions of material in a kind of Iron Age context and a post-Iron Age context, you know, fascinated me and made that suddenly available. And I think, you know, for me, I think that this project has become very much about my relationship to tradition and trying to, it's made me think in a different way about some of the works, for example, around Drawing Restraint 9, which are cast thermoplastic, but they're, you know, the difference between those works and these metal works formally isn't that different. It's you know, and they're both made in a casting language, but I think their relationship to tradition is extremely different.
Yes, I think you're right.
I read somewhere that the name of your legal entity is Remnants LLC?
Remains.
Remains LLC, sorry. And what is interesting about that is that it seems sort of the sculptures, some of your work is always a remainder of something else. The film is a remainder of the performance, and the sculptures are a remainder, in a way, remains of the film. Is that something conscious of yours to sort of always have something leading up to the next, or?
Well, I feel like it's tricky with sculpture that if something is merely a relic, it's a relic. You know what I mean? And relics can have a really strong presence, but I think for it to function as sculpture, it has to have a different quality, and it's difficult to say what that is with regard to something that has the history of passing through the narrative, you know, when it stops being a relic and starts being sculpture. And I feel like that's something I can sometimes will, and sometimes I can't. Like sometimes it declares itself that it cannot be a sculpture, and that's it.
So there are elements from the film that you don't deem, that are not in the show in Munich, that are not sort of...
Sure, yeah. And even things that I kind of thought had that potential, but by the time they pass through the narrative, they don't, for whatever reason. And others that I think can be abstracted willfully. And others that need to be rebuilt, you know, with a different approach. So the form remains, but the attitude is different. And it's never the same. It's a little bit of witchcraft.
Magic.
Can you talk a little bit about your approach to casting in River of Fundament? There's a wide array of people in that particular film that, you know, are known actors, musicians, artists, Lawrence Weiner, Salman Rushdie, Debbie Harry, various actors, Ellen Bernstein, Paul Giamatti, is that right? So I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit about how you understood casting.
I mean, I think it's another element in the project that has to do with naturalism. You know, like taking an approach that I hadn't taken before, using dialogue, for example. You know, having a couple of scenes which are really dialogue-driven. Have never tried that before, and I think with that in mind, the casting, you know, was an attempt to create a situation that would feel very natural in terms of the wake. You know, to fill this recreation of Mailer's house with people you would expect to find there, even if they, in fact, didn't have a relationship to Mailer. Many of the people did, some of them didn't. And But I think with those like Paul Giamatti, for example, didn't. But I know he has a strong relationship to the literature, and he felt like somebody who could be there, you know, rather than somebody who was there. And then a lot of the casting choices were driven by Jonathan's interests also in how they would, you know, how a kind of musicality would be brought out of somebody who, you know, had some comfort level with music but wasn't necessarily a musician. I think it's one of the things that interests him very much, is to try to pull musicality out of someplace you don't expect to find it.
Right, okay.
You know?
And someone like Lawrence Weiner, how would he show up? What's the thinking there driving that choice?
Well, he's a pharaoh, isn't he?
He's a pharaoh. He's a pharaoh.
In his own right.
No, he is a pharaoh. You're right.
We haven't even, you worked on this film for how long?
7 years, I guess.
And it did change, sort of the project changed its course throughout the process in a way. Can you talk a little bit about these turns that you took and why?
I guess we talked a little bit about it already. The notion that the piece would be performed on stage. Moving on from that idea, we thought the piece would be staged in site-specific locations, sort of as a series of...
In 8 at first, right? Or
7.
Okay.
It would be a work of situational theater in 7 locations. And I think after the first experience, it started to feel like, you know, the level of complexity in staging one of those things was a little bit overwhelming. And it was also cost prohibitive, to be honest. It was, you know, in that we ended up staging something in Los Angeles and in New York that was along the level, complexity-wise, of the feature-length films we had made, you know, that would run once over the course of a day, with limited rehearsal and, you know, limited testing. It was a little bit crazy to do that, or to the thought of continuing to do that. So, you know, there were a number of reasons why we started staging scenes for the camera. You know, one, as I said before, had to do with direction. It had to do with point of view, you know, to give the piece a spine or a perspective. And it was also a financial decision. It was also a decision in terms of, you know, how much time and energy can be put into one thing, you know, and whether we could sustain it. A lot of reasons. So, and it was a collaboration. I mean, it was a really, I mean, I've done one other collaboration with Elizabeth Payton, but this was, you know, it was a pure collaboration, and that way everything takes twice as long, you know. So it's a long time to be inside something.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about your interest in Egyptian mythology and the Book of the Dead? Because again, that's something that comes before Norman Mailer, if you like, and something I'm sure is important to you as well as a kind of...
Well, again, I think it was one of the things that frightened me about using this text, because it's so explicit. And, you know, it's a narrative that everybody kind of carries with them. So I think that you know, that ends up being both interesting and limiting. You know, but there's so much transformation at the core of it. So it's certainly something that appeals to me.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's sort of easy to align my language with it, but maybe it was harder to find ways of, you know, maintaining mystery, which, you know, which I think we ended up doing through the American vernacular, trying to impose an American vernacular onto the novel and onto the mythological scenes. And so there was a little bit of, rolling up the sleeves and solving the problem of its obviousness,
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about, I guess, essentially the kind of American vernacular that you used, how you thought about that in relationship to just the Book of the Dead and all that sort of thing, just essentially how that comes out in the film.
Well,
and it's important to your language. I mean, generally, it's very important to your language.
Yeah. I mean, I think during that time where things were much more organic and the project wasn't really fixed, Jonathan and I, we visited subterranean mines. Like we went to a lead mine in Mexico, a mine in Poland. We considered some locations in Germany. So we were really thinking much broader about the place where this could happen. And, and I was still kind of working my way through the text, really. I mean, it's a hard one to read, but still working through it and feeling that its Americanness is so strong, and that that eventually it felt just so important to tell the story in the States in terms of how we would treat the text. And
yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about the toward the end? There's a whole Native American kind of story, and I think Norman Mailer is the kind of third. Is it right? The third kind of reincarnation of Norman Mailer. Is that right?
Yes.
You can talk a little bit about those scenes. So they're very evocative with the buffalo and the deer.
yeah.
And the oil, I guess.
Yeah, and I think this grew out of, the interest in colliding Mailer's language with another language, with Whitman and Emerson, and let's say a more kind of circular sensibility, and how that could be carried by the women in the story. And specifically with Nefertiti, at times with the widow of Norman. But I think out of that notion came this out of let's say the Whitman language came this idea of bringing native music into the fold. And it's something that Jonathan was interested in, and something he had played with a little bit in Cremaster 2 with the scalp songs, and which were sort of combined with the two-step language, the Texas two-step,
yes.
Right? So it grew from there, and
the male-female relationship in the film, I think, is very interesting, that it's sort of the woman, the wife, that turns into the mother for the transformed main character. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of that kind of relationship in the film?
Yeah. Well, I think it really it crystallized with this notion of bringing the Whitman text in, I think. And that there is this character in the novel who does help the protagonist transform. That she.
That's Nefertiti.
Exactly, as you're saying, she's sort of simultaneously the wife and the mother, and he becomes his own father by having intercourse with her in his last breath. And and so that character, was obviously provocative and became more compelling to me as a way of trying to use this other language and to, in a way, take Mailer to task on some level, by colliding a more existential language with this more religious language, and to collide a more circular approach to this more linear approach. And
so that character wasn't as strongly developed in Ancient Evenings, the female?
It is, but it is. But it doesn't have the kind of polarity to the protagonist that it does in River Fundament.
How do you see that more specifically, the whole sort of male-female relation? Though, in a sense, it seems in this film, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there are more women. There's more of a focus on women. Does that seem gender on femaleness, or? I mean, I think you've been so associated with masculinity, and as I was watching, I just felt there were many women characters, but I don't know if that's.
Yeah, I mean, it might be because the women survive in the end, and the men don't, right? In a way that. I mean, I think certainly the starting point was to do with a kind of constellation of fathers, and that kind of, anxiety of influence, or however you want to say it. I think, that was the entry point in the way that it, it had certain relationships to Cremaster 3. And then as it developed, I think that this interest in articulating the women in the story in a different way from the text became more and more compelling to me. And that I really felt like I couldn't, in that the piece isn't truly an adaptation in that way. I think it needed to have, it needed to take the text to task in some way for it to work for me.
Yes.
And that was one of the ways I think we chose to do it.
Yes.
Does Mailer's sort of quest for immortality that Harold Bloom sort of saw in the book, is that something that interests you as an artist?
I mean, I'm interested in, like I think any sculptor has to be, I'm interested in, the investment of the spirit into the object, and so, on a more abstract level, for sure, I'm interested in that kind of transformation. So, I think on a more literal level, no. And again, I think that this first instinct to collide the Cremaster language, like a more existential language, into a religious one was compelling to me. So I do feel at odds with the text in some way. Like I don't feel like the film embraces Ancient Evenings completely. It's both sympathetic with it and in conflict with it.
Can you talk a little bit about the title, actually, River of Fundament? And you obviously changed it, didn't call it Ancient Evenings because it's not, as you say, embracing the book completely.
I think it's just to do with this, that elemental language that, for me, is central to the text, or the aspect of the text that I'm most interested in. And it also it's a word that's used a lot in the text to describe the excremental state, and this sort of river, the river of death, or the river of feces that one has to swim through to live again. And so there's a way in which excrement has this sort of primordial soup quality, rather than being literal. as waste, that it's also the beginning and the end.
There's that very beautiful sort of moment in the beginning of the film where you see the new plants sort of grow out of the manure, basically. And I think that's a very beautiful image for that idea of the rebirth and the nourish for something new.
You want to talk a little bit about the set of Mailer's house as well, because that seemed to be so kind of lovingly recreated, or very detailed in its creation. Do you want to talk a little bit about about that particular set, maybe that scene more generally, because it seems very, it's a room that we come back to over and over again in the film. Think about the Lego and the African sculptures and the books, all the beautiful books and photographs. And
I mean, I think the original intent was to recreate his apartment as best we could. And in fact, we considered filming in his apartment, but it would have been difficult to do what I wanted to do there with the degradation and the transformation of the space. So we set out to build it, and I had been communicating with the Mailer estate after Norman's death, and we were able to borrow some of the objects from his house and his library. That was his library in the film, and the set was interesting in the sense that it was one object that was built for the interior scenes, which we shot inside my studio, and then we moved that structure outside with the outside clad for the exterior shot. So it was really effectively a house that we built, more than a set, which is typical for me, that I would make something that you could really shoot in the round, rather than a breakaway set. I don't tend to do that. So, and that really I think it affects everything. It affects the behavior of the performers. It affects the mobility of the camera, and the ingenuity of the cinematographers to deal with the physicality of the situation, which I think is very important. And so we took that same structure and put it out on the barge on the river, and filmed the exteriors out on the East River and in the industrial canal there, the Newtown Creek between Brooklyn and Queens. And what was interesting is that after filming for months, all these characters who come up out of this basement space that's flooded, with this sort of tide line of, water and excrement. Sandy came, like right after we finished, like literally 2 days after we finished, and the barge was still out on the water. We had to take it and take it to protection in the industrial canal, and it held up, but the storm basically did away with all the detail on the set. And so there was a very strange relationship between the story and that storm.
I was also thinking about something that came to me this morning. There are these incredible scenes again in the apartment, and it will cut to another room where the children are, and the children are playing musical instruments and perhaps games, but providing the soundtrack for things that are happening in other rooms. Do you want to talk about how you came to work with the children in that way? Because I don't know, I thought it was a very beautiful, kind of quite moving, sweet, very sweet moment in the film.
I mean, that was largely driven by Jonathan's interest, I think, in that kind of, naive approach to, sound making and music making, and that he really wanted all of them to be much younger. And, like with the other casting choices, I was interested in representing the 9 children that Mailer had with, a range of kids that could be plausibly siblings.
Right.
And so we ended up with a kind of balance in between that, there's a kind of an artificiality to that is appealing to me.
Yeah.
But, the starting point might have been a more naturalistic representation of the siblings. And it ended up being, like a sort of satellite speaker or something.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And one of his 9 children is in the film.
That's right, yeah, John Mailer's Norman the First.
Was that an idea that you had from the very first, when you started conceiving the project, or did that come later? And was it difficult to convince him to play his dead father?
Well, it was not on the table in the beginning. Neither was the wake scene, really. That was developed a little bit later, and with that came this role of Norman. And John was the first person cast of the 3 Normans, and just as it felt right for Mailer to play Houdini in Cremaster 2, it felt right for John Mailer to play his father in this piece. And he's a performer, he's acted and both on stage and on screen, so I think it was an easier leap for him to take than some of the other performers I've worked with.
Well, he was here, and he said that it was definitely the hardest role he's ever done.
Yeah.
But a wonderful one.
Yeah. Yeah, we did ask him to do some difficult things. It's true.
In the scene of the wake, or the kind of dining room of Mailer's house, there are these 2 big chunks, 2 big objects, 2 big rectangles. Salt is sulfur?
Sulfur and salt, yeah.
And is this is again going back to this notion of what's under the ground and what's in the ground? And how did you come to just think about actually visualizing them like that? I mean, they make me think of boys a little bit, but I'm just kind of curious. You just talked earlier about this performance with the big slab of graphite, so this kind of big, dense, square, heavy objects.
Yeah, it was somewhere, I think, between being a kind of elemental state and
tomb-like.
a coffin,
Coffin,
basically.
so
I'm sort of
tomb-like,
thinking about, like, what sort of wake is this, and thinking about how the guests would come and go and how the environment would change. And part of that was to do with who would come when. And so we started thinking about Irish wakes, which are a little bit more open-ended that way. People come and go, people get up and perform and sing, and there's a coffin in the center of it, and people put their drinks on it. And so it sort of existed in that model in a way, but of course there's a formality to it that is different than that.
And there's an empty palette as well, wasn't there? There's an empty palette beside.
That's right.
The third one.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, which is, I think, to do with this protagonist who, through sorcery, through his, what did he do? He ate, in the text, he eats the excrement of bats. In the film, it implies that he's eating the excrement of humans to sort of learn what they've learned. So by eating some aspect of their waste, you gain all of their knowledge. And so through this and through his alignment with Hafrtiti, he's able to figure out a way of living again. And it works a couple of times. And then the last time he tries it, he gets stuck inside the womb, and he can't leave, and he's finished. So so the empty palette, I think, is to do with that state of it.
Incompletion.
Incomplete. Yeah.
Should we take some questions from the
Yeah.
audience, maybe? Wow, there are many.
Hello, Mr. Barney. You're one of the most thoughtful and articulate artists who speak about their work working today, I think. And I have a question relating to the theme of anxiety, which you brought up specifically, the anxiety of influence. And it's I haven't read Harold Bloom's review of Ancient Evenings, but that sounds very much like Bloom to suggest that Mailer was operating under that pressure. And you spoke also about the tradition that you were coming from and that perhaps exerted some kind of anxiety or influence on you, which was that of post-minimalism. But today, actually, looking at the photographs of the early drawing restraints, one thing that really popped out to my eye was that bold graphic logo of the Nike shoes that you're wearing. And what interested me about that is that there is another forking path in modern art, which was pop, which was operating, as you know, in parallel to minimalism and post-minimalism. And the direction that your art has gone in, specifically this idea, I'm very interested in how an artist crafts and molds their biographical legend or mythology. So while you were producing works, you were also documenting them in ways that increased in terms of a sort of spectacularization, drawing influences from mainstream, let's say, cinema. And this idea of whether there is a kind of anxiety about capitulating to sort of mainstream forms insofar as you're using elaborately choreographed sort of set pieces, action pieces, and how you negotiate that balance. How does one, as a contemporary artist, negotiate that idea of being an avant-garde artist, but at the same time being a celebrity, being an art star? How do you prevent your films simply from becoming commercials for selling merchandise? Now, I know that's a very cynical view, and I'm not accusing you of it, but I was wondering if there is a kind of anxiety for you operating at that level of capitulating to a sort of mainstream and losing the charge of a kind of avant-garde currency, or whether you even see it that way.
Have you seen River Fundament yet?
No, I haven't seen it.
I don't think there's any danger of Matthew becoming mainstream anytime soon. It's not a Hollywood blockbuster.
No, but I mean within the context of the art world, being a kind of celebrity.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what the question is completely. But I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking about pop, which you brought up, and surrealism. In the way that I think people tend to ask me what my relationship is to that material. And I always feel like I don't have a very strong relationship to it, although I think you can find it in the work, you know, like whatever I've absorbed. I think that my influences are much more to do with you know, the language of sculpture, the language of performance-based sculpture, and how, you know, if there is an anxiety, it's about wanting to push that language as far, you know, out into, let's say, the real context, which, you know, is sort of littered with you know, what pop is left behind. So I think it's more about the way that language collides with the sensibility of pop, and then trying to keep the work from not functioning as image, you know, but functioning as form. And that there's an anxiety that I feel. Like, I think when I start to feel my work being over-reproduced, like, it gives me a lot of anxiety, actually. If something, you know, when you start to think about works that you've seen more in reproduction than you have in person, they become images, you know, and I think that's something that scares me, because I think because I've pushed my work so far out into the realm of, say, cinema or performance or something that functions more in the world than the visual arts do, and so I do have that anxiety that I feel sometimes I've pushed it too far, and that it's at some point it's unrecoverable, you know, that if it becomes image, then I've failed. And that's probably not your question.
Thank you,
but,
that totally answers.
all right.
Thanks. A question for Jorn and for Matthew. Jorn, why did you want to bring Matthew to Toronto for this year's Luminato? At what point did you make the decision that, oh, we've got to have Matthew Barney? And Matthew, you've scaled the height of the art world remarkably quickly, and I wonder, was there a really conscious effort to do that? How did you accomplish it?
Should I start? And then I think for me, the desire to work with Matthew started maybe 15 years ago. At that point, I didn't know that I would be in Toronto 15 years later. But I saw Matthew's work for the first time when his Cremaster films and also the exhibition was at the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. And sort of saved a lot of money, well, not a lot of money, but because train rides in Germany are cheap, to go and see it, and was utterly blown away by the work of an artist who created a whole new language and whole new form in a way. And so when this opportunity came up to present River of Fundament as part of the Luminato Festival, I immediately leapt at it. We had sort of known each other a little bit already beforehand, and it was sort of a no-brainer in a way for me to want to bring him here. And I thought, and then I approached Kitty and Kitty Scott from the AGO and Matthew Teitelbaum about showing sort of another body of his work, the drawing Restraint, parts of the drawing Restraint works at the AGO and the TIFF Bell Lightbox that are screening the entire Cremaster cycle at 4 p.m. this afternoon, because I thought it would be it's a great chance that a festival has that maybe an arts museum or sort of a more defined institution doesn't have, to be able to present the work of an artist who works in so many different media in all its sort of variety, and to introduce or to bring an artist like Matthew to Toronto, I think is really the great pleasures that my job offers me.
I mean, yes, I'm ambitious for sure, but I think that my ambition is to do with scale and complexity, and I think it always was. You know, I mean, if I think about where I started, when I started exhibiting work, which was a long time ago, by the way. I don't feel very young anymore. But I think it was always, that initial impulse was really as much about rejecting what was around me, you know, as any other young artist, you know. I think that, you know, at the time in New York, the kind of pictures artists and the kind of Neo Geo work, like this is what was in galleries, you know. So I think what I was doing and what a lot of other artists from my generation were doing didn't have a place in the galleries at all, you know. We all finished school thinking we would be exhibiting in alternative spaces. That would be our path with this sort of performance-based, installation-based work that at that point in the 80s wasn't sort of hard to imagine it being sold, you know, or placed in a gallery. And what happened as I was graduating college is the art market collapsed, you know, and I think it's something that affected my trajectory a lot, because I think it opened things up in New York, and people from my generation were able to start to show publicly very early. And I think from there, you know, I think it's really just to do with you know, to developing complexity and adding complexity and scale to challenge my habits. And it's the way I look at it, really. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. First of all, I remember you working your way across the ceiling in Soho. probably 20 years ago. I'm more curious about your choice of James Lee Byers in that role. And I watched the film and I was like, why is that so familiar? And I do remember, seeing him in galleries, walking around Soho 20 years ago. I'm just more curious about how you view yourself in relationship to his role, his persona, as a shaman, trickster. He credited peyote buttons and things like that for his sensibility. And that's the question. Do you see yourself in that role? In the films, possibly, or not?
I mean, I think I already spoke quite a bit about him, but I think my relationship to him is more oppositional, really. I mean, I think that we're very different. I think that my interest is in physicality, and I think that the theatricality that I work with comes out of a very physical practice, and the kind of conflict of inherent in the tournament, and the physical, a more kind of physical confrontation. Byers is very different. Yeah. So, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Now, maybe one last question, because then we have to get Matthew over to the TIFF Bell Light Box.
Hi, Matthew. My name's Chris. I'm an artist from Detroit, and I just had a question about that location. And I know as an artist, starting off with an idea, going into an idea, sometimes that idea becomes so strong that it fractalizes into other things. And just wanted to know if that location spurned other ideas for future projects.
For sure. You're speaking of the steel mill?
Well, just Detroit in general. I understand, kind of your metaphor of it being a wound and creativity kind of coming out of that wound. And I think you kind of have to either go there or understand it on a deeper level to get what you're saying. So I just wondered if there's anything in the future with that area, that came out of this project, maybe to reinvestigate. That's essentially my question.
Well, I said that, that this language of sculpture, I think, came largely out of the text, but I also think that experience in Detroit of making that ironwork on the grounds of the McLuth steel factory where the body steel was made for the automobile industry, and to experiment with metal casting on a more medieval level in terms of the technique that we use. I think that gesture, carried through the last 4 years of my sculpture making practice for sure, and influenced it, and it will continue to for sure. I was in Detroit last week and went through Hamtramck and visited the Powerhouse Productions houses and some of the other houses, and I think and seeing the difference in Detroit, even in the last couple of years since I've been there, is already pretty significant in terms of the absence of architectural situations, where buildings have been extracted, houses have been extracted, and these sort of intervals have opened up between houses and buildings that feel I don't know, it sets up a kind of compelling rhythm, like Brush Park, for example, the way that those intervals are kind of random, but they start to establish a rhythm that you wouldn't consider on a street that way. And to see art start to fill those gaps, I think, is hugely inspiring. Not just as a sort of healing gesture, but also in terms of what sculpture is for me on some level. That it's about displacing the human in in an interior, and the way that art has the potential to have this sort of aloofness, the way that a person does, that it's a presence that can exist in that kind of gap between, and in that way, Detroit keeps fascinating me. Every time I go back, it's something else.
Just like to thank you, Matthew and Jorn. Thank you so much for coming today and for coming to Toronto and just expanding our understanding of the film and your practice in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you.